Well, thank you so much for having me. In my role with Youth of Christ up in Aylesbury Vale, I'm usually inviting other people to do all the talks and don't normally do too many of these myself. Not at a popular level anyway, but it's wonderful to come down to Dorset and to see you and to do this and to speak on something that's very close to my heart. I'll just give you a brief look at my background. I wear many different hats. Sorry, next slide, please, if that's right. I'll just do the nod and point thing, I think. Oh, no, not that far. Oh, is there not a slide in between? Oh, okay. All right, well, you'll just have to take my word for it. So my background is in genetics and molecular biology. I did genetics as an undergrad at Cambridge. I did first year immunology, but then quit that because I preferred genetics. I did molecular biology as a master's level at Birkbeck. But I also did a theology degree at the University of Chester, and my undergraduate dissertation was on defending theistic evolution. I stayed on for a master's at theology in theology at Chester, looking at science and religion in the interwar period, particularly the physicists of Einstein's generation. I'm now doing a PhD in history and philosophy of science at Manchester Metropolitan University, where I'm an associate tutor in philosophy there. So that's one of my hats, that's my academic hat. So I teach the undergraduates there in history and philosophy of science. I'm a science communicator, so I'm a science writer for The Conversation, for the Institute of Art and Ideas and for The Free Thinker, and I also write for the Church Times and the Catholic Herald on issues of science and religion. So I have a colourful life. It's very interdisciplinary, and I'm very interested in particular where science and Christianity intersect. My history of science work is on the interwar physicists, particularly Sir Arthur Eddington, Sir James Jeans, and Edward Arthur Milne. But generally, what the physicists and the astrophysicists and the astronomers of the interwar period thought about the New World. Everything they knew about the world being ordered and straightforward under Newtonian physics had changed. In the space of a decade, you had quantum physics, relativity, and the birth of Big Bang cosmology just come along and overturn everything about what everyone knew about the world. So I'm exploring the physicists of that period and the conclusions they came to. And we'll look at that a bit later. I'm the director at Aylesbury Vale Youth of Christ, and what I do, I work with the secondary schools in the area, a lot of grammar schools, just bringing academics, researchers, scientists into the area to speak in schools about their work. And almost all of them are Christians, and the students find that absolutely fascinating. So I love working with young people, and I'm very passionate about that outreach. I'm an associate of the Royal Society of Biology. I'm on the board of the Mars Society UK. Spaceflight is sort of a very active part of my research life. At the moment, I'm doing some research into human genetic engineering so that people could live on Mars. And we can, if you want to ask about that later, then you can ask about that. I'm an ambassador for the Genetics Society, and my molecular biology research is going to move to the University of Reading next year. Well, I'll be doing a second doctorate there on particularly on the structure of DNA repair proteins. So with my biology hat on, it's all about DNA repair and the implications there for cancer treatment and things like that. But the coolest part of my job is 2 or 3 times a year I get to work with NASA astronauts, which as a kid who sort of grew up on Michael Foale and the space shuttle, that's very, very cool. So a couple of times a year I get to work with astronauts. And as part of that, in November 2021, I was working with a team of students who won a competition to have their experiment flown to the International Space Station. So in May last year, an experiment that I was involved with got flown by a SpaceX Dragon to the International Space Station to get researched in space. So I may never go to space, but I feel like a tiny little piece of me has. So that's that. Right, I want to talk on this topic today, which is something I don't hear Christians talk very much about. One of my PhD mentors is Lord Martin Rees, who you might be very familiar with. He's sort of the last one alive of Stephen Hawking's sort of great generation of physicists, and he's at the Institute of Astronomy in Cambridge. And he's what I call a futurist. someone who's always looking at the frontiers of what's next over the horizon. And what I find is that Christians don't normally talk about this. Christians tend to be either the voice of caution, saying, let's be careful with the technology, let's not go too fast, let's think about this. Or it all comes under the banner of the end times and eschatology and the book of Revelation. And, let's not think about a technological future because the world will all end and then we'll all be in heaven with Christ. Whereas I think if you look back in history, Christians have very much been the voice in the earlier days, looking at the future, saying, how can we make it better? How can we develop medicine, build more hospitals, develop education? Christians used to be the front runners of futurism with a hope of alleviating suffering, a hope of making the world a better place. And so today I want to speak to you about science, religion, and the future of humanity. So we'll be looking back at the past a little bit, we'll be assessing the present, and then I want to take a look towards the future. Now we'll go, next slide please. And we're going to start with this, the early Royal Society. Sir Robert Boyle, who's the father of modern chemistry, and Francis Bacon, who you could argue was the father of modern science as we know it in this country. You had Christians at the forefront of the vision for humanity's technological future. Science was very much seen as an opportunity to heal and improve humanity's lot. For Robert Boyle, he talked about his makeshift laboratory as a cathedral. And when he was conducting chemistry, it was an offering of worship to God. More on that a bit later. But I want to leave you with this idea this evening of a Christian vision for a better future. A vision that was one of healing and progress and making life better for everyone as service to God. But we're going to go way, way back. I said we'd start at the past, and we'll start at the distant past. The very, very, very distant past. Creation, even. Darkness, void. When I ask astronauts about what space is like, especially those who've done spacewalks, there is such a stark contrast between when you are in sunset. So there's no sunlight because the sun is behind the earth, and it's just absolute black, black, black for us. But up there, that's when you get all the stars. That's when you can see them all, because the sun's light has gone, and you see the Milky Way in its glory. You just see more clearly than you ever would on earth what the heavens look like. And then when the sun rises, that's when actually it all goes dark. You can get a great view of the earth, but that is the blackest black. I said, what is it like? It's the blackest black, a complete void. I think the closest idea you could get to the void, the darkness, is that blackest of blacks. There's no light whatsoever. You can't even see any of the stars. They're completely veiled from you because of the light of the sun behind you. The expanse is just astonishing. It's really, really hard to think in terms of the scale of what the universe is. I've got George Lemaitre there on the left, the Belgian priest who was at St Edmund's College, Cambridge for 1 year in 1924. So 100 years ago he arrived with the mission of applying Einstein's equations to the cosmos. And he described to Einstein in a letter, he said, "You seem to have contrived a day without a yesterday." And Sir Arthur Eddington arranged for his papers to be translated into English, and then wrote the first English language book on the Big Bang, a book called The Expanding Universe in 1931, which you can still get today. On the picture on the right, you have a very famous photo from the Hubble Space Telescope called the Hubble Deep Field. And every single one of those lights in that picture is not a star, it is a galaxy. Because you can't see stars outside of our galaxy. But when you look out at that, the sheer scope and scale is extraordinary. And not only is it extraordinary, it's expanding at ever greater speed. Everything is rushing away from us at higher rates of speed. It is not slowing down. In our time right now, we are in the sweet spot of the universe's life. Right now, where we sit, this is the sweet spot of the universe. This is the sweet spot of deep time. There's never been a better time for planets to form, stars to form, galaxies to form. One day, it will all suffer slowly under the laws of thermodynamics and peter out. And that will be an inevitable end. But at the moment, we're in the sweet spot. There are 26 fundamental constants at the heart of the equations of the universe. And that's just a start. There are about 60 constants and quantities to account for. This has confounded astronomers and astrophysicists who are religious and non-religious. A very famous non-religious one, Sir Fred Hoyle, was very, very unhappy at the nature of the behavior of matter inside a star. It did not please him at all that things do not seem to be behaving the way they should behave. Arthur Eddington, one of our most famous astronomers who was a Quaker, put it this way: something unknown is doing we don't know what, was his description of it. Einstein remarked that nature is not only stranger than we imagine, it's stranger than we could imagine. The universe is very, very complex. It really is not simple at all. It's very interconnected. It's a paradox of the very simple and the very complicated. And it began 13.7 billion years ago, but 4.6 billion years ago, our solar system formed. And under intense early bombardment, including of which the formation of our moon came about, the Earth was born. And it was very quick after the birth of our planet that life came along. Thank you. And life was born. It's as extraordinary as the birth of our universe is, the birth of life on this planet. The speed at which it came about is extraordinary. And we're moving more into my fields of biology here. But life is a paradox, an immense paradox. We know its ingredients, yet we have absolutely no idea what it is. And anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong. It's a fascinating field, it's a booming field, it's a growing field. We have more tools now to apply to the problem. But what is life? The question what life is one of the oldest and hardest questions in philosophy of science. You say, well, life can grow and reproduce. Well, so can a snowball. But no one's going to argue that a snowball is alive. The pandemic recently brought back in vogue the question of whether or not viruses are alive. I don't believe they are. And I actually don't know any virologists who believe that viruses are alive. They're sort of a pre-life, maybe. They're more just molecular machinery that's dependent on something else to be active. On their own, they're completely inert. But life is very, very hard to define. Ancient life can still be traced in molecular fossils, which is the most fascinating place to look. But if you go to places like Western Australia, or down to the deep ocean vents, if you're lucky enough to know someone with a deep sea submersible, then you can get a look at what life might have been like or was 3.8 billion years ago. Simple single-celled life has developed many, many times across the globe, and it centers around the idea of an RNA world. RNA, the cousin of DNA. Which is all living things possess, into the DNA basis that we see everywhere today. Life's blueprint remains the same, and it's the only known format of life in the universe, is the DNA and RNA format that we know, the carbon-based life that we know. Multicellularity took a long, long time to come about. There's a huge, huge gap in the history of our planet between the first traces of life and multicellular life. But once multicellularity came along, the diversity of life on this planet exploded despite multiple extinction events and the Earth's volatility. Life is extraordinarily resilient, and yet we know of absolutely nowhere else in the universe where it exists. Thanks to the James Webb Telescope and its predecessor, the Hubble Space Telescope, the search for exoplanets is very, very much on. European Space Agency is doing some very interesting work on exoplanets at the moment. And you can use spectroscopy and methods like that to scan for gases which would be a clue to life elsewhere in the galaxy. But as yet, we have nothing. So life is resilient, and it seems to be inevitable wherever it is possible, and yet we only know of it here. Many Christians have been and are at the forefront of this research onto the evolution of life. Some of them are very, very inspiring people to me. I'd name Simon Conway Morris, who's a research fellow at St. John's College, Cambridge, and one of the fathers behind the idea of convergent evolution, as a very important voice in this. Next slide, please. Now, when people think of evolution, they think of random, purposeless chance just at work. And that seems like a very unbiblical idea. But they would be wrong. See, I don't think there's much random, chaotic process at work in the evolution of life. When we dig in, we actually find a very different story, the idea of convergent evolution. And convergent evolution is so important. It is a grand unifying theory in biology. It doesn't matter if it's medicine or structural biology or everything in between. Convergence shows up everywhere and is a very important idea. Life seems to have a blueprint, and evolution is not as random and chaotic as we think. Life has a solution to its challenges, and this is often follows highly constrained avenues of success. If you think about a wing, wings show up in dinosaurs, wings show up in bats, wings show up in birds, and wings show up in insects. And yet none of them are related particularly closely. You have to go way, 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 way back. These creatures did not evolve wings from each other. Life says wings are a good survival strategy. So rather than everything being random and chaotic, there are avenues of success which evolution proceeds down, where it finds ability to flourish, even though they haven't inherited it from each other. Think of the camera lens eye. There are loads of different organisms that have the camera lens eye, and yet we're not particularly related. We did not inherit eyes from each other. Everything from the light-sensitive photophores that you can find in plankton all the way through to the eyes with which you're looking at me today that we see in humans. Again, camera lens eyes are a very successful strategy. So they show up over and over again, but they're convergent. They're not inherited. And this plays out for me in my work on proteins. So you find convergence in proteins all over. Think of the immune system that different organisms have. There are proteins for DNA repair, like the ones that I research. There are proteins involved in the immune systems of all kinds of different organisms, but they're not inherited from each other. They've just proven to be a very successful strategy for life. And so they show up over and over again. And this is convergent evolution. Wings, eyes, movements, even genes, proteins, and immunology follow patterns of convergence. Life, just like the universe, seems to have a blueprint. It seems to have a strategy for success, which is very hard to explain and very interesting for me as a believer in God. Now, where is God in all this, as I anticipate questions about evolution that might come afterwards? Well, I want to give you a first response, if I may. Next slide, please. I don't know if you've read C.S. Lewis's The Magician's Nephew, or The Silmarillion by Tolkien, and the creation story in that. But I take great consolation as a Christian in the writings of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and others, not just because I live near Oxford. The painting on your left is called Aslan Sings the Dawn. And if you've read The Magician's Nephew, the children enter the world and it's void and dark and cold and there is nothing there. And then suddenly a song can be heard in the background. And as the song begins to play, the sun rises for the very first time. And they see a lion on the horizon. And as he's singing, light is entering the void. And then things begin to grow and move, and the witch becomes startled, and she's got this, sorry, I'm giving you all the spoilers now, aren't I? You should go and enjoy The Magician's Nephew. But she takes this part of the lamppost, which she's taken from the human world, and she throws it at the head of the lion because she can't bear the singing and everything that's coming with it. And it just rebounds off his head, making no difference at all, and lands on the ground and grows with the song of creation into the lamppost in Narnia. When I think about convergent evolution, when I think about creation, and life and what it is and how it's risen up, when I try and reconcile that with the data, what I find is something like Aslan singing the dawn. Or you have the great composer of the birth of creation in the Silmarillion by Tolkien, where God is like the master conductor, and I've got a pen here, even better, and he's playing, and as he's playing and as the music goes and as creation goes, let's prune that, let's change that, let's shape that, let's hone that, let's grow that a bit more. It's like life has some sort of inbuilt creative freedom from the Creator itself, and it's still the song goes on. That's how I see it. It resonates with me. It may not resonate with you, but it resonates with me. The idea of God as the master conductor and master architect. But if we press a little further, next slide please, we find actually in Charles Darwin's generation there was a problem that needed solving. You see, this was the golden era of natural theology. You had the Bridgewater treaties where rich Christians were commissioning explorers to go and bring back things for museums like Richard Owen's Natural History Museum in London and places like that. Bring back evidence from the natural world that can tell us more about the Creator. And this, of course, was the century of William Paley's watchmaker argument, of finding a watch in a field. As an idea of nature being designed. But you see, we had a problem. This was a century of great revival, great religious growth. It was a real boom period. You'd had the century in the 18th century of the Methodist revival and the first Great Awakening with Jonathan Edwards over in the United States. Christianity was growing and booming and flourishing in this country like never before. People were being filled with the Holy Spirit, and there was great enthusiasm and excitement for a God who was present and active and involved. But when it came to the natural world, the idea was the opposite. God had pushed a button at the beginning of creation, everything had been made, and now God was not involved at all. So in every single area of a person's spiritual life, from as the individual through to church, you had a God who was present and active and involved, but then when it came to nature and creation, he wasn't. God had just pushed a button, everything was made, and then he left. This did not match up. The idea of God in the natural world did not match up with our understanding of God as present and active and involved. And there was great consternation about this, great debate about this, and that's actually the academic theological background to the time that Charles Darwin came along. So when Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace come along and bring the idea of natural selection and the first ideas of evolution, there were a huge number of theologians who were delighted and relieved, because this is more like the picture of the God that we actually believe in, a God who is involved in creation, that creation is ongoing and continuing, and that there is a creative driving force behind the development of life that is still very much going on. So you had Asa Gray, who is the man in the middle there. On the left you have Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, who was married to a wonderful Christian woman, Emma Wedgwood. And so the first edition of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species doesn't mention God in praiseworthy terms, but subsequent editions did. Or on the right, one of Darwin's great mentors was a wonderful Christian man, John Stevens Henslow, a famous biologist and naturalist in his own right. So the picture you get very much from the fundamentalists or from the big creation ministries is that, Darwinian evolution is this sort of satanic idea that comes in to undermine the Bible. It certainly was not received that way, as you may have thought. Actually, the picture was very, very different. As Asa Gray put it, finally we see that God has instilled in creation the ability to create and develop itself. It was the idea of the creative blueprint of the Creator himself was still at work in nature, developing nature to meet every challenge. Wherever you had death coming in, you had life rising up to meet it over and over. So that is an active God in creation, not a passive one. Let's continue to move on, though. I gave a little bit of a mention as to the birth of modern science in a Christian crucible. Modern science itself owes itself to a very active theistic Christian worldview. At the birth of the Royal Society, you had Robert Boyle, Francis Bacon, and others. It was a gathering completely of Christians. You wouldn't have found an atheist among them at all. And the idea was, God has given us two books, the book of his word and the book of his works. And one should worship God and celebrate him and contemplate him in both. That was Francis Bacon. They believed that because God was a lawgiver, there were laws at work in nature, and one could understand nature because we had the mind of Christ. God, the ultimate lawgiver, has built a nature and a world and a universe that is governed by laws, and because he has made us in his image, and we have the mind of Christ, we can understand it. Therefore, it was the Christian's duty to understand the world, to explore the world. Nature itself is a sacrament. Next slide, please. The universe should be intelligible. And Boyle wrote of this as an act of worship and devotion. Going into the laboratory was worship and devotion to Sir Robert Boyle. And it was to others. I put there René Descartes on the left, Blaise Pascal in the middle, James Clerk Maxwell, the great physicist at the top, Maxwell's equations. Michael Faraday at the bottom. Faraday's legacy is continued in Cambridge with the Faraday Institute of Science and Religion that a friend of mine, Dennis Alexander, is currently in charge of. So nature itself is a sacrament to God. And we should be inspired to worship. We are inspired to worship. It is the most natural human instinct to observe the glory of nature and respond. You can't avoid the response. It's like a hammer to the knee. It brings a reflex. There is a natural response of wonder. In the smallest child and the oldest person who's seen it 10,000 times, the response is still the same. The two books analogy of Bacon's is very much true. And it's this instinct of wonder that I believe in science points you towards God. It's the wonder more than questions of evidence. But we'll move into my field of history and philosophy of science for a second. What about the interwar physicists? You see, there's this crazy story that we got about 20 years ago from Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett and many, many others, that religion had been the thing for humans for a while, and then along came modern science, and especially along came Albert Einstein and his generation, and bang, that was it. We grew up. We grew up into a much better world. And it's just nonsense. I mean, that story fails upon first examination. Who was Einstein's God? Well, Einstein wasn't a Christian. He had been born Jewish. He believed in the God of Spinoza, very much more a deistic mind, super mind behind the universe. But Einstein was no atheist, if you read his writings. And he had some very fascinating things to say about Jesus. He said, "I'm enthralled by the figure of the Nazarene." Schrödinger and Heisenberg and many of the contemporaries, I include Eddington and Jeans in that, during this interwar period, this boom period in physics, may be the most powerful breakthrough decade in the history of science. That sort of end of World War I through to the 1930s, where you have extraordinary discoveries, one after the other. These people came to the conclusion that mind was not subservient to matter more than ever before, but mind was preeminent over matter. The observer is now very important. The observer is not less important, they are more important when it comes to relativity and quantum physics. Mind permeates the universe. These people were not hardcore materialists at all. There was a mini revolution in idealism, in philosophy. Werner Heisenberg was very open about his faith later on, after the Second World War had finished. He said, the first sip of the glass of the natural scientists will make you an atheist, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. The picture's very complex. It's not simple. I don't want to make it simple. There are a lot of dynamics, and there are a lot of personalities, and there are a lot of moving parts. Next slide, please. But one cannot ignore interwar physics and the argument it makes away from atheism. Georges Lemaitre, who I've mentioned, the father of Big Bang cosmology, was a priest, an active priest. Sir James Jeans was one of the great writers of interwar physics and has many laws in stellar physics which are still used today and will live forever. Edward Arthur Milne, one of the great astronomers of the interwar period, wrote a book in 1952 called Modern Cosmology and the Christian Idea of God. He was a very devoted believer. Sir Arthur Eddington is seen as the ideal Quaker physicist, and his books during the interwar period would outsell some of the most popular science writers of today if you were to sell them in Waterstones or somewhere like that. And this was a boom period of discussion and intrigue about science and religion. It was not the end. Sure, in 1925, over in America, you had the Scopes monkey trial, which we will be remembering in a centenary next year, sadly, where you had a Tennessee school teacher on trial for the crime of teaching evolution in a secondary school, and you had people outside holding up crosses, waving them, singing, "Give me that old-time religion." But over in Britain, it was a very, very different story. Very, very different story. The story was very academic. It was very intellectual. In fact, in 1925, that exact same year, you had a compilation book called Science, Religion and Reality by the would-be famous chemist Joseph Needham, a very famous chemist, very important chemist. And it was a collection of writings, some from Nobel Prize winners, some from other prize winners, many Cambridge and Oxford minds, on the interplay between science and religion and the true picture of reality, not an atheist among them. And then in 1931, after that proved so popular, the BBC commissioned its first ever symposium on science and religion, which you can still get today if you're lucky enough. And it again is a who's who list of incredible scientists writing on science and religion, and not in the Richard Dawkins terms. No, not at all. Materialistic atheism could not give an account of the universe where the mind and the observer reign in importance. It can't. So the story about science and religion from the 20th century is very, very wrong, especially at its most important period. Let's look to molecular biology for a moment as we look to where we are today and the world we inhabit right now. The boom period of biology was the 1950s. Francis Crick and James Watson presenting the structure of the DNA double helix, one of the most beautiful structures in all of nature. Every child recognizes it. Maurice Wilkins, who would go on to give an Arthur Eddington Memorial Lecture called Science and the Divine, shortly after he won the Nobel Prize himself for his part in the structure of the DNA double helix. Rosalind Franklin, the brilliant X-ray crystallographer, who's a hero and a legend at my old institution of Birkbeck, who has the lab of molecular biology in her name. And the brilliant Fred Sanger, who himself was raised a Quaker, one of only 4 people to win 2 Nobel Prizes, was the first person to enable sequencing of DNA and of proteins. The father of the Human Genome Project, which we in this country took a huge role in between 1990 and 2003. I think there is extraordinary beauty in biology. That's instinctive to a child. Next slide, please. On the left, you have the protein that's at the forefront of my research right now, human mut S alpha, which is a DNA repair protein which scans the DNA double helix continually, looking for errors, looking for mistakes. When it finds it, it sends out some signals, recruits its buddies, and then just like Lego, assembles to build a complex to call some more help if the break is particularly bad or the errors are particularly bad, or fix it itself if it's just a small mismatch. But on the right, I've got a snowflake. Because I think proteins are beautiful. I think proteins are biology's snowflakes. Just like every snowflake is a different shape, every protein is a different shape, but the difference is with proteins, their shape helps determine their job. They're like keys of different shapes, and each one needs to be the shape it is to do its job. And so when you're exploring the world of proteins and DNA, you're constantly bombarded with beauty, and its structure determines its function. And I think there's an instinct of worship and wonder that comes with biology as well as astronomy and physics and those sorts of things. Let's move to the present day. Where are we now? We've looked back, and I hope anyway, I've shown you God very much in the picture as we look back. But what about now? How many of you recognize this picture from last week? A huge breakthrough in spaceflight and in human history, the first ever civilian spacewalk. A mission in Polaris Dawn that went to the highest altitude since the Apollo moon landing days, higher even than the highest Gemini flight, and only the second all-civilian crew in a commercial spaceflight into low Earth orbit. Where are we now? Well, let's stick with biology because I'm biased. Next slide, please. We are in the most exciting and incredible decade since the 1950s in biology. In fact, I would argue that the last 15 years rival the 1950s in terms of breakthrough and importance for biology. And I must admit that the public understanding and knowledge of where we are does not match the reality of where we are. We are much further ahead and on much more extraordinary ground than the general public understand. But I'll give you the greatest hits for now. Cancer immunotherapy since 2018 has transformed the landscape of cancer treatment. You know, we started with surgery and we moved to radiotherapy and chemotherapy. And then now we are in the era of immunotherapy, where instead of just blasting or cutting out cancer, you train and prime the individual's own immune system to target tumor cells. And like heat-seeking missiles, they move throughout the body, finding all the tumor cells that match that signature, and the body fights the cancer for you. It's very, very expensive. The costs need to come down. But if they do come down, and I believe they will, cancer treatment will be changed forever. And that is helped significantly by two other developments. Drug development is being transformed by structural biology, because in the last 10 years, we've had significant technological advances in cryo-electron microscopy, and now this year in X-ray crystallography, the first super developments in X-ray crystallography since those 1950s, where now you can visualize what a molecule actually is, its shape and its structure, at much higher levels of accuracy, at much smaller resolution. But perhaps even more impressive and important than that is the developments in artificial intelligence in improving our ability to predict the shape of a molecule purely from its sequence. AlphaFold, if you haven't heard of it, you will soon, is DeepMind's artificial intelligence program for predicting the structure of a molecule purely from its sequence. And the results that it gets are as accurate as actually doing the experiment with X-ray crystallography or cryo-electron microscopy, which means you can take the sequence of a protein, just its amino acid sequence, and guess almost to the same level of accuracy and sometimes better the shape that it actually is. When you can do that, when you can accurately show what a molecule's structure is, you can transform drug development. It will revolutionize drug development. Then you have genomics and gene editing. You see, the Human Genome Project to sequence all 3.1 billion letters of human DNA in the nucleus, in the genome, took 13 years and cost 3.1 billion between 1990 and 2003. Now you can do it with a handheld device in a few hours for less than $1,000. It has been done in the field, it is done in the field everywhere with the Minion device by Oxford Nanopore Technologies, but it's even been done in space. Astronaut Kate Rubins took a Minion to space and sequenced the DNA of all the microorganisms on the International Space Station with a handheld device. We've gone from 2003, it costing 3.1 billion and taking 13 years, to you being able to do it in space in a few hours for less than £1,000. What that means is we now have so much data of the genomes of living organisms. There's a project right now to sequence the genome of every single living creature on the British Isles. You can do that now. What can you do with that data? You can compare the genomic makeup of any 2 organisms, any 10 organisms, any 100 organisms very, very quickly. You now have access to data that we didn't have before so easily. That the dream of medicine is personalized precision medicine. I want to treat you and your illnesses and ailments according to your unique physiology and your genetic makeup as accurately as possible. I don't just want to give you drugs. You're going from grenades and rockets to sniper rifles, a very targeted approach. And this is all happening so fast, but it intersects genomics and gene editing and drug development, cancer immunotherapy, they intersect. What if I could edit the drugs I give you for your cancer immunotherapy specifically towards your physiological makeup or the genomic makeup of the tumor itself? I could give you drugs targeted just for you. I've mentioned gene editing, but I haven't explained what happened. That's this picture here. In 2011, we really broke through into the CRISPR world. If you haven't heard of CRISPR, you soon will. CRISPR stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Short Palindromic Repeats. That's not the important part. I'll test you on that later. But CRISPR-Cas9 is a beautiful little machine that we've hijacked from the bacterial immune system. That's right, bacteria have an immune system. What they do is they take these little sequences of any virus that invades them and they keep them on record. And then they go throughout the cell, and whenever that virus shows up again and some random DNA that they don't quite recognize is coming through the bacteria, the CRISPR-Cas9 checks it and says, oh, I know who you are. You're an invader. We've seen you before, and snips it. And that's the end of that. What it means is, in computer terms, think of cut, copy, and paste. You can use this brilliant little device, this brilliant little nature machine that we've borrowed from bacteria to cut any sequence in the 3.1 billion letters. At a certain point, I'm looking for these letters in this order. Well, now it will scan the genome, make a cut there, and then what you can do, you can cut it out, or you can insert something that you need, or you can disrupt something or change something. Well, we live in a CRISPR world now. Gene editing is cheap. You could do it in a high school lab for very, very inexpensively. And now we have base editing and prime editing, which rather than cutting a sequence, allow you to change a single letter, a T, an A, or a G, or a C in your genome. You can just change one letter. We are in a new world of gene editing. And with that comes synthetic biology, directed evolution. You can make changes to an organism's genome in ways that you want. Now that opens us up into a brave new world, if you'll pardon the pun, of what changes do we want to make to nature? What do we want to borrow from nature's toolkit? And there are ethical questions that come with that. There are huge, huge questions that come with that. But we are in a Christian world. You can't put that back in the box. It's here now. It's here for better and maybe for worse too, but certainly for better, for medicine. Next, artificial intelligence. We're in a landscape of new robotics. Industry is going to change. The workforce is going to change. Education is going to change. We are moving into a world that is, science fiction's become science fact very, very quickly. Very, very quickly. Next one, please, because I'm aware I need to race on. And what about spacefaring? Can anyone be an astronaut these days? It seems like you can. We're going back to the moon. We now have rockets that can take people to Mars in very large numbers. The Starship is the biggest, most extraordinary rocket ever built, and it can take about 100 people to the moon or to Mars. The SLS, which is going to launch the next Orion mission, the Artemis II mission next year, costs about $1.3 billion to launch. The Starship is bigger, more powerful, and it costs 10% of that. So what does that mean? What does that mean for our future on other worlds? Well, it means it's here now. You can get to low Earth orbit so cheaply and so quickly now that the space world has changed. And we're in a new space race. You have China, you have Russia, you have India, and you have Europe, and you have America. The new real estate is not on Earth, it's in space. Who's going to win that race? Who's going to get the precious metals and the precious materials on the moon or on Mars or one of Mars's moons? industry, the world is going to change. Think it was 66 years between the first 12-second flight of the Wright brothers and the Apollo 11 moon landing. That's how quickly technology can move. In 2066, what is the world going to look like with all of these? Now, I am a big fan of SpaceX. Like I said, I'm on the board of the Mars Society. The world is moving in places that I'm not sure people are prepared for. But the big question I want to ask here is, what future does that give religion? And this is something that a lot of secular voices are speaking into, and not many Christian voices are speaking into. In a world of genetic engineering and spacefaring and artificial intelligence, what future does God have in that world? What future does God have in this technological utopia that many people are reaching for and dreaming for? Steven Pinker wrote a book a few years ago, the man on the left, professor of psychology at Harvard, called Enlightenment Now, calling for a new enlightenment, like the 19th century Enlightenment and the 18th century Enlightenment. A new era of reason and rationality where religion just moves back and science takes us forward into this glorious future. Yuval Noah Harari on the right, who you might have read Homo Deus or Sapiens, some of his bestsellers in Waterstones, has said religion has been an interesting part of our past, and it's helped us get here and it's helped us survive. It's been of great evolutionary value, but now we should recognize it as a historical relic and move forward with a better philosophy and better science into what the future holds. And the man in the middle is Lord Martin Rees, who's actually, I'm very familiar with Martin. He's been helping me a lot with my PhD. He's an amazing person, but a real futurist, talking about what it will look like when we colonize the solar system. And what's it going to mean to be human in that world? When you're gene editing yourself so that you can survive the harsh radiation of Mars, and you've got robotic implants and nanotechnology running through your bloodstream, what's it going to mean to be human? At what point are you no longer human, but you're more some sort of cyborg? What will it mean for our robotic companions? Will they have rights? Will they have character and personalities? Will they be more human than us, seeing as they've been programmed by us and we are still evolving? What's it going to mean? What's it going to mean? Will we destroy ourselves before we get there, which is Martin Rees's warning? Well, I want to answer that with a few short anecdotes, if you can bear with me a little longer. First of all, Apollo 8. Now, we lost one of the Apollo 8 astronauts over the summer. Bill Anders sadly passed away, aged 90, while flying a plane, which is such a fitting way for him to go. The man blocked out on the left is the Commander Frank Borman, but he's not the one I want to talk about. In the middle, you have Bill Anders, and on the right, you have Jim Lovell, who went on to command Apollo 13. Now, this was the first time that humans had ever left Earth orbit and ventured to another body. You might remember at Christmas Eve 1968, they were flying to the moon, and they orbited the moon 10 times, I believe it was, before coming home. And they took that famous photo, the Earthrise photo, which was the most reproduced photo of the 20th century. And as they were coming back, they read from Genesis chapter 1, over the live broadcast. It was extraordinary. Now, what did they learn? What did they say? Well, you got two very, very different reactions. Bill Anders came back an atheist and never went to church again. He said he saw the earth hanging there in the void of space and said the idea of little Johnny sitting on his bed and God looking down on him, wondering if he's going to say his prayers or not, to him seemed ridiculous. And he ended up doing some work with Richard Dawkins and encouraging him in his atheist ventures. But Jim Lovell had a very different reaction. When Jim Lovell was interviewed about the meaning of the Apollo 8 mission, he said what he learned looking at Earth there, hanging there in the dark, was that God has given us a stage, and how the story goes is going to be up to us. So one came back a convinced atheist, and the other one came back more profoundly impacted in the God direction. Now, Chris Hadfield says that space tends to have a confirmation bias. People who are atheists go up and come back more atheists. People who are religious go up and come back more religious. So make of that what you will. But their answers, it's interesting that two people can look at the data of science, particularly in a moment of such extraordinary promise and wonder, and come to completely opposite conclusions, isn't it? So there is no hard and fast rule here. Next slide, please. Another astronaut, Jerry Ross. Now, Jerry holds the record for the most ever trips to space. He's been to space 7 times. And his last flight was in 2002 on the space shuttle to construct the International Space Station. He did for a while hold the record for the most amount of time spent spacewalking. But it was his last spacewalk in 2002 which was particularly interesting. And I recommend people read his autobiography called Spacewalker. He talks about having finished a job on a spacewalk assembling the ISS. And he's on the robotic, hanging on the end of the robotic arm by his feet of the space shuttle. And they say, Mission Control says, Jerry, can you just hang on for a few minutes? We've got to take care of some things down here and figure out what to do next. So they just raise him up, and he's there strapped in with his legs, just standing there, waiting for 10 minutes for instructions as to what to do. And he said he had a profound, deep spiritual experience, a feeling of being one with God and the universe, just hanging there on the end of the robotic arm, just looking out at the cosmos, just being one with it. A profound spiritual experience like nothing he'd ever had on earth. A deeply Christian man. Next one, please. So how should we understand science and the world? Well, Sir Arthur Eddington wrote a book in 1929 called Science and the Unseen World. And Eddington, a very famous astronomer, and he said, many people come into my observatory and they look through the telescope and they see the stars, or they see the rings of Saturn. And they look at me and they quote Psalm 19 verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God and the skies show the work of his hands. And he said, and myself and many of our colleagues roll our eyes. And the question is, well, what comes to mind for you then when you look through the telescope and you see the stars or you see the rings of Saturn? And his answer is a very different Bible passage comes to mind. And he started to quote 1 Kings of Elijah in the cave. And Elijah's in the cave and he's ready to meet with God. And in comes a great rushing wind, but it says God was not in the wind. Then comes a mighty earthquake, and it says God is not in the earthquake. Then comes a roaring fire, but God was not in the fire. And then afterwards comes the still small voice. And the way Eddington puts it, he says meteorology, seismology, and thermodynamics all pass before in silence. But afterwards comes the voice of God, why are you here? Why are you here? He said, that's what I feel when I think about God and the natural world. And the first time I read that, I thought, oh, I like that. I don't understand it, but I like it. And that was the start of my venture into Eddington. But it's seeking, Eddington says. Seeking is the spirit that drives science and religion. It's the same spirit. And I think it's the same spirit that drove Francis Bacon and Robert Boyle. It's the spirit of the early Royal Society. It's the spirit of those first Christians who began the modern science revolution here in this country and around the world. As Johannes Kepler put it, science is thinking God's thoughts after him. When quantum physics came to the fore, Einstein was offended. He said, God doesn't play dice with the cosmos. And Niels Bohr, the great physicist, said to him, Albert, stop telling God what he can't do. We shouldn't tell God what he can't do. Instead, we should think God's thoughts after him. I have one final personal story, if you don't mind. I became a Christian in my late teens through reading the book of Revelation, actually, in my bedroom at 1 o'clock in the morning in the middle of summer holidays. I was very down at that point in my life and it was 1 o'clock in the morning, I couldn't get to sleep. And I thought, well, I'll read something. But I didn't have many books on my shelf beside my PlayStation. But I had a Bible I'd been given when I was born, and my grandmother had written my name and date of birth in it. And I opened it, and I turned to the last book of the Bible. God knows why I opened the Bible. I just believe God set me up that night. But I thought, I'll read the ending first, and if I like the ending, I'll read some more. And the Jesus I found in the book of Revelation was not the Jesus that I really knew and understood growing up in Sunday school. Jesus being born in a stable and riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. Jesus in Revelation is this glorious, powerful conqueror. Very, very different. And I was a very enthusiastic Christian in my late teens and in my 20s, and my faith fell on some hard times through church in my 30s. I'm 40, if you need to know. And I went through some deconstruction. A lot of my friends lost their faith. In fact, my best friends lost their faith. A lot of people I thought would never ever lose their faith lost their faith. But I couldn't lose my faith, because even if my heart wanted to, my head just knew it was true. It was my brain keeping me in, not my heart. But I was angry and I was distant from God. I didn't go to church for almost a year. Couldn't without some tremendous anxiety. I could not read the Bible. I didn't read the Bible for about a year. It was just too hard. And my prayer life was just completely dead. It was God help, or God why, or God where are you, without any answer. But I was doing my genetics degree at the time, because I went to university much, much later on. Next slide, please. Final slide. And I had in my head that I wouldn't get to Christmas without my situation getting better if God was there for me, if God really cared. And Christmas came and went, and things were not better, they were worse. And so I was kind of done at that point. But I went to university on the weekends, and so I drove to Cambridge looking forward to controlling the only thing I could control, which was my studies. And my very exuberant professor insisted that instead of a day of lectures, we were going to be doing practicals, because it's not real science if you're not doing a practical, according to him. And so we were going to spend the day looking at green and red algae. Surprise. Happy New Year. And so I'm there with everyone else in the lab. I can never tell this story without crying. You'll have to bear with me. And I'm not thinking about God. That's the last thing I'm thinking about. I'm looking forward to a day of science. But I go up to my microscope and I look down the microscope, and I had a deeply profound experience of God, which changed my life, saved my life, I think. I just looked down at this algae, and it felt like the roof of the building came off, and heaven just came to me. And there were no words. It's an experience that I just can't describe. It's very, very difficult to put it into words. But it was like God came into the lab, came over to where I was standing, and just put his hands on me. And there were no words, but it was a real, powerful, physical experience that was overwhelming. And I went to the bathroom and cried for about 15 minutes. But I drove home different. See, all it told me, all the experience told me, was that God remembered me. He knew who I was. That I wasn't forgotten. And within a month, everything had turned around. And, the Bible was not, God wasn't going to speak to me through the Bible. And he didn't speak to me through prayer, and certainly not through church. But he came for me in the lab. And people have said to me, because these are the only algae I remember, and they are beautiful. I think they're beautiful. When I show people that, they go, wow, yeah. But people have asked me, was it the beauty of God's creation? I'm like, no, it was algae. Like, was it the beauty, the intricacy of God's design? I'm like, no, it was algae. I didn't look at algae and go, wow, God is real. I kind of knew God was real. I just didn't want to know. I was angry. But I keep these guys on my phone and on my laptop and everywhere I can, just to remind me, my permanent reminder, that God remembers me and knows who I am, and that I am in his thoughts. So for me, science and God, it's not about evidence. It's about wonder. It's about seeking. It's about that instinct. It's about that touch. And that's all I'm going to say now, because I realize I've gone for an hour. But as we look to the future, I look to it with hope, because I remember those algae. And I look forward to your questions, but I think maybe if we take a minute or two for anyone to use the bathroom or get another cup of tea and think of any questions you might want to ask. And thank you for your time. I hope you've enjoyed that this evening.